Hi, and welcome back to Design and Technology Online. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at a topic in design and technology called primary sources. And what I mean by primary sources is, where do we get our materials from? Okay, where do these materials that we make our products from, that we take for granted, where do they come from? Where's their origin? What do they start life as? Okay, and that's the theme for today's lesson, primary sources in design and technology. So to start us off then, a quick do now activity. So the question is, what different materials can you name that are used to make products? Okay, so what different materials can you name that are used to make different products? So teachers, if you want to pause this, give the class 2 or 3 minutes, discuss with somebody next to you, what different materials can you name that are used to make products? Okay, good. Hopefully you've had a good chance to have a think and have a chat about the different materials that you can think of that are used to make products all around us. Okay, and what you've all got might be very different and very varied. So let's have a look then. So there's probably lots of materials that you were able to come up with, but some of the main ones that hopefully you've got on your lists then. So we've got wood, metals, plastics. A lot of products are made from glass. Paper and cardboard. So a lot of products are made from paper and cardboard. And textiles. I've forgotten about textiles. We do wear, and we have a lot of products made from textiles. Okay, not just clothes, but textiles featuring cars and vehicles. Textiles is often forgotten when we're thinking of materials. And there's many, many more. And some of the images show you just the different variety of materials that make up the products that surround us on a day-to-day basis. And some products even use more than one material. For example, the bike on screen uses way more than one material. Okay, so it's not just one material that products are made from, they're often made from a few. So the question is today then, where do these materials come from? Okay, where does wood come from? Where does metal come from? Where does plastic come from? We're surrounded by products that we take for granted. We use day to day, whether it be clothes, chairs, toys. All these products that surround us on our day-to-day lives are made of materials, and they all start life completely differently. And it's today's lesson, we're going to have a look at the primary sources of materials. We're going to have a look at the origins of these design and technology materials that we make products out of. Okay, so what I'd like today then, class, is I'd like you to write the title, The Primary Sources of Common Materials. And what I'd like you to do for today's lesson is I'd like you to draw out the table in your books or on paper. Okay, so column 1 is the materials. We're going to look at 4 common materials found or used in design and technology. We're going to have a look at the primary source, so where it comes from or what it's made from. And then we're going to have a very brief look at the process. So how does it get from being a primary source, a raw material, into a workable material, something we can make a product from. So if teachers would like to pause the video for 2 or 3 minutes, what I'd like the class to do then, please, very neatly and carefully, can you draw this table out? And we're going to use it to take notes on today's lesson. Okay, so hopefully you've got the table drawn out in your books or on paper. So we're going to look at 4 key materials used in design and technology. We're going to look at timber, we're going to look at metals, we're going to look at plastics, which we know as polymers, and we're going to look at textiles. So the threads from today's lesson, we're going to look at the material, its primary source, so where it comes from, what it's made from, what raw material it is that makes these workable materials, and the process. Okay, we're going to briefly look at the process of how we turn that raw material into a workable material that we can make products with. Okay, so as we go through the slides in the video, what I'd like you to do is take notes in the relevant boxes. Okay, so let's start. So our first material, and probably the most common material that you might be familiar with, and probably the most commonly used material, certainly in design technology at secondary school, is timber. Okay, you probably know it and call it wood, and it's good practice to start to call it timber. Okay, so timber then, I think this is probably one of the more straightforward materials that we'll look at in today's lesson. So where does it come from? What's its origin? Well, the primary source of timber is trees. Okay, it's no trick question. The primary source of timber is trees. Okay, and we use these trees and we cut them down to create timber, which is then turned into timber products. And we're going to have a look at the process. And so how does this work? So the process then of converting trees into timber. Well, quite simply, the trees are cut down. Okay, we have to cut the trees down to begin with to collect and harvest this timber material. And the correct term for cutting trees down is felling. Okay, so that's a key term. So felling is the correct term for cutting down a tree. So the process begins with cutting down the tree. The trees are then transported to a sawmill or factory, and then we are left with logs. Okay, we've got these logs to work with. So what happens to these logs? So at the minute, these logs aren't really much use to us. So the logs then are sawn into planks, using as much of the log as possible, giving little to waste as possible. And if you have a look at the picture on the right hand side, you can see this log and how accurately it's been cut out. You can see all those pieces there that sort of start to resemble what you'd see in a hardware shop or a timber merchant's. So these logs are cut up using heavy machinery, heavy saws, heavy duty saws, extremely accurately to make the most out of every single tree that's cut down, and to make the most out of it, maximize the material that is gained from that tree. So timber or wood, but we need to start getting used to calling it timber. It comes from trees. Okay, timber comes from trees. The process is felling. So cutting the trees down is called felling. And finally, once the trees have been felled, they're collected up, taken to the sawmill. And these logs that you can see in the top right there, they're sawn into planks. And then it's these planks that after a couple more processes can start to be used as a material. Okay, let's move on to material number 2. So material number 2 is metals. So metals are used in a wide variety of products, from jewelry, chair legs, cars, aeroplanes, and other vehicles. Okay, metals are an extremely common material, and it's one of those materials that allows a lot of products to function because of its extremely strong properties and abilities to withstand forces. But where do metals come from? So it's a little bit less straightforward than timber. Where do metals come from? So the primary source of most metals is something called ore, and ore is a simple term for rocks that can be found in the Earth's crust. So in the Earth's crust, we have ores, and it's in these ores that we find and can harvest metal. Okay, some metal comes and can be mined on its own, but most metals are in or found in ores, okay, which are rocks in the Earth's crust. So how do we get these ores? How do we get them out of the ground and out of the Earth's crust? Well, the process starts by the ore being obtained through mining. Okay, so ore is obtained through mining, and you can see in the pictures you've got 2 types of mining here. The left-hand side, you've got underground mining. Okay, so the ore is being drilled out and collected. And then on the right-hand side, this is surface mining. So again, the ore is being blasted, collected, and then taken away for processing. So the process for collecting metal ore is mining. But these rocks, when we've collected up this metal ore in the form of these rocks in the Earth's crust, it needs to be processed further. Now, most metals, the ore is placed in something called a blast furnace. And this is a huge cylinder which is put under extreme temperatures. And what happens is the molten metal is separated from the rocks. Metal ore is placed in a blast furnace, and then it's subjected to extreme temperatures, and then the molten metal separates from the rock and then can be collected and then used to make our metal products. And that's not all metals, I will say, but it's most metals. Some metals like aluminium use a different process for getting the metal from its ore. So that's material number 2 then. So our metals, they come from a rock called ore. So metal comes from ore, which are rocks found in the Earth's crust. The process, well, ore is obtained through mining, as you can see in the pictures on the right hand side. And then once the ore has been mined, it's placed in a blast furnace where it faces extreme temperatures, and the metal then liquefies, becomes molten metal, and separates from the rock. Right, material number 3 in design and technology is our plastics. And again, a bit like wood and timber, we need to get familiar with calling plastics polymers. Okay, so plastics and polymers is our 3rd material. Where do these come from then? So the primary source, the main primary source of plastic is crude oil. But we can also get and make plastic from coal and gas. We can also get some natural plastics, but at the minute, the main primary source of plastic is crude oil. Now, crude oil, if you have a look on the right-hand side, it's a very thick, dark liquid that is collected from under the ground. It's collected and then it's taken away and it's converted then into plastic. And I say, it's not just crude oil. Crude oil at the minute is the main primary source, but also gas and coal can be converted into our plastics. So believe it or not, the plastics, the chairs that you sit on, the toys you play with, come from crude oil. This thick, gloopy liquid is collected from deep in the Earth's surface. So what's the process and how do we get this crude oil and how does it work? So the process, crude oil is obtained through drilling. So the process then is drilling. And to get this, we have to drill into the Earth's surface. As you can see from the picture on the right hand side, these big pipes are drilled into the Earth's surface into pockets of oil. It might be inland, or it can be obtained out at sea. Okay, so underneath the seabed, pockets of crude oil can be found, and big pipes can be drilled down through the seabed to expose and to harvest this crude oil that we use to make plastics. So we've got crude oil then, we've got this black, thick liquid, but it needs to be converted into chemicals that we can then turn into our plastic products that we're more familiar with. So how does this work? So very briefly, the crude oil is heated in a process called fractional distillation. And if you have a look on the right hand side of the slide in the video, there's a very simplified diagram that shows you fractional distillation. And what happens here is the crude oil is put into the process. It's heated to a very high temperature. And what happens is at different temperatures, different chemicals can be collected. So the crude oil is put into the process. It's heated at a very high temperature. And at different temperatures, different chemicals are collected. And one of which is used to make plastics. So there's crude oil, it comes in, it's heated, and chemicals are collected. And one of those chemicals is the one that we use to make our plastics with. And finally then, so our 4th and final material that we use in design and technology are our textiles. Okay, quite often forgotten when we talk about design and technology, because we often focus on the harder materials, but textiles are extremely important, and they're probably more commonly around us than you realise. Clothing, football goal nets, accessories, curtains, sofas, furniture, all these products in cars, in the kit interiors of cars, all of these products are made using textiles. So where do our textiles come from then? What are they made from? What's their primary source? So the primary source of textiles then, so there are two main sources of textiles and fibres. So actually with textiles, they come from two groups of primary sources. So it's slightly different to the others. They come from two different groups of primary sources. So we're going to have a look at the two now. So the first group then are known as our plant and animal-based natural fibres. The first group are our plant and animal-based natural fibres. So things like cotton comes from a plant, cotton plant. Our wool comes from animals like sheep and alpacas. And finally, our silk comes from a silkworm, believe it or not. Okay, so our plant and animal-based natural fibres are cotton, wool and silk, and these are either grown and harvested or collected from animals like sheep, alpacas and silkworms. Then they're turned into a fibre, a thread, and then they're spun together to create products. And then the second group of textiles, and the primary source for the second group of our textiles is synthetic or man-made fibres. So we do, and we have created nowadays, synthetic and man-made fibres. And believe it or not, these are made from coal and oil. So their original source, their primary source is coal and oil. So we've managed to convert coal and oil into man-made fibres. And some examples of those are polyester, nylon and lycra. And believe it or not, I can imagine a lot of you have come across the word polyester, okay, because a lot of the clothes that we wear these days does contain and made from polyester. So two primary sources then for textiles. We have our plant and animal-based sources of textiles, which is cotton, which is wool, and which is silk. And then we have our synthetic or man-made fibres, which are made and come from coal and oil, believe it or not. And some of those are more common than you'd imagine. Things like polyester used in a lot of modern day textile products and clothing. Okay, so that draws of today's lesson. We've looked at the primary sources of common materials used in design and technology. We've looked at timbers, we've looked at metals, we've looked at plastics, and we've looked at textiles. We've looked at where they come from, what's the primary source, and then we've briefly looked at how they are processed or converted into workable materials, which we'll move on to in a bit more detail going forward. So thank you again for joining me, and I'll see you next time for our next design and technology online lesson. Thank you.